This is the Sustainability and Climate Change panel. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Hila Levy. I'm Colorado and Exeter 2008. Back in Oxford for the second time around. I'm going to try to be moderating with these amazing women that we have here. And over the last 40 years that Rose Women have existed, environmental issues have also become a real pressing issue in society, perhaps due to the unfortunate realities of how humans have impacted our planet. And in that same time frame, many Rhodes Scholars have dedicated themselves to doing important work in the environmental arena. So today in this panel on climate change and sustainability, we will hear from Rhodes women working in the legal, political, practical, and scientific aspects of those very challenging issues. So I'm pleased we have this mix of talents and also a mix of generations. This is probably the largest span of generations on any panel, I think, of years. Speaking today. And so I'd like to introduce these amazing women. To my left is Jennifer Haberkamp. And she recently finished her tenure as the Obama administration's ambassador and special representative for environment and water resources in the Department of State. A very impressive and long career in government and in law, and as a trade representative for the environment and natural resources. She worked in the Court of Appeals, she worked at George Washington Law School, Johns Hopkins Graduate School. She's on many boards of important significance in this field, as well as in the trade realm. And she has led to several successes, including the 2016 signature of the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol to phase down the use of hydrofluorocarbons, as well as the ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization's landmark agreement to control global greenhouse emissions for international flights. So some big successes there from Ambassador Haberkamp. I'm pleased to have her on this panel as well. You may have seen her earlier this morning on another panel on politics.
I'll try not to say the same thing.
And we also have, to her left, we have Charlie Graydon from Alberta, Canada. And she's an academic, a writer, a journalist, and would practice law in Canada. She has had academic positions in England, New Zealand, and Canada, and is now on the faculty of Euclid University and a fellow of the World Mediation Organization. She's a member of many boards as well herself. She's published 4 works of literary fiction, and she's developed many programs for students and judges and corporations on all kinds of environmental and legal issues and alternative dispute resolutions. She also works on several working groups and UN working groups on mediation and sustainability. So I'm pleased to welcome Charlie. And then we have Clark Knight, who is one of our more recent scholars. So she holds a BA in chemistry from Smith College. She recently finished her time here at Oxford doing an MSc in water policy and MSc in biodiversity conservation, and is currently working on her PhD at Berkeley in environmental science, policy, and management, some issues dear to my heart, looking at California forest ecosystems and ecology and managing carbon as part of her initiatives to try to help support the science behind policy in California. So welcome, Clark. And we have Sarah Bronin, who is here from Hartford, Connecticut. Sarah is an author, a professor, an attorney. She's currently an endowed chair in real property law at the University of Connecticut Law School. She also serves as a director for energy and environmental law for their faculty, written many articles on sustainability, books, renewable energy, and I think really interestingly, she is a licensed architect. And she has won several awards for the design and rehabilitation of their own home, where her and her husband and 3 children live, which is very interesting and exciting. And so she comes to us with that practical aspect of developing many of Hartford's award-winning efforts on actual urban change and sustainability and urban planning and zoning. So welcome, Sarah, today. So what I'd like to do is start off with some of the more personal aspects of these women's very impressive trajectories and careers. And so the first question that I'd like to pose to the panel has to do with if you could go back 10 years. I know that puts you all at different points in your lives, but if you could go back 10 years and give yourself advice, what would you tell yourself?
I think Clark should start.
When I was 15.
Turbulent time in life. Let's hear hear what you have to say to your 15-year-old self.
Yeah, actually, it kind of was because at that point I was in high school and one of the few women taking the IB program, the International Baccalaureate at my high school. One of the few women in AP classes, and so probably just to like stay the course and to not worry. You'll get into a good college, that kind of thing. But yeah, I think my interests were just in doing well in school, and so just to stress out less would probably be the biggest advice I would have.
Charlie?
Yes, now I'm going to say I would not change anything from what I did 10 years ago. I left the practice of law, I left Canada, which is, I mean, I love Canada, but it was cold. Very, very cold. Yes, there's a theme about that. So I now live in Spain and France, in the south of France and in the northeast of Spain. Beautiful, beautiful weather. But what I was going to say is I also changed my profession. I moved from being an academic and a practicing lawyer to a position where I can't practice law in Spain. I can't practice law in France. So what I did is I became a journalist. I studied and became a journalist. And also I have written 4 books, 3 in English, and 1 in Spanish that I did not. I had a translator take my first book, and we worked together to write a book in Spanish. So for me, that was a very excellent experience to change my trajectory completely. And now I was recently hired to teach online at Euclid University, so I'm back in the academic world and very pleased. So I wouldn't change I would just stay the same.
Okay. Any advice that you would have to yourself 10 years ago, Jennifer?
A little bit. I mean, 10 years ago was when I went back to work full-time after taking 4 years to work part-time when my kids were young. And I think it's more advice I would give myself over my entire career, which is don't overstay in a particular job. Because I tend to be loyal to the places I go to, and I stay a long time. And I think sometimes I would have enjoyed a new challenge or gone in different directions if I'd left sooner. And I ended up staying in the job that I took then for 7 years, which was okay. But I think that would be one thing professionally. And then personally, I would want to, all over my entire life, do more active things with my free time. You know, while I love nature, I love being outdoors, and I'm living in Washington, D.C., where it's pretty, but there's not a lot of natural beauty. So I would try to do more things with my time.
And I'll piggyback on this kind of personal realm, this reflexive realm. And is there someone or something that inspires you in what you do, especially such difficult work? I'll start back with you.
Okay.
If there's...
Well, I think probably the person who inspired me the most is the Ninth Circuit Federal Court of Appeals judge who I clerked for right after law school, Betty Binns Fletcher. And she was, you know, Sandra Day O'Connor cohort, the kind of person who absolutely great student, first in her law class, and then had trouble getting a job in a law firm, but eventually then, you know, became a real leader in the Washington State Bar and then Court of Appeals. She was dedicated to justice, and so whether it was Indian law, environmental law, immigration law, she, you know, I thought made the right decisions in the right direction. And I mention her in part because her father was a Rhodes Scholar, and I think she's somebody who probably should have been, but was before the time.
Interesting. Thank you for that. Charlie, do you have a source of inspiration you'd like to share?
Yes, and I'm going to say there are 2 people I want to talk about. One man who has always been very, well, he's deceased, but he was the person who inspired me to take a lot of the avenues that I followed, and that is Pierre Elliott Trudeau. Now, recently we were determining a little bit about Mr. Trudeau and one of his sons who passed away, and so I knew what the answer was, but you know, when you left your country 10 years ago, you're not sure. So what I would say though, Pierre Elliott Trudeau had a vision for Canada, and it was a vision to bring the country together, and that to me is something that has been very important to me. And similarly with this group, dealing with sustainability and climate change, my feeling is we need to work together. We need to work in a collaborative way and a cooperative way to address the issues, because it's not tomorrow, it's now. It's like right now it's happening, and we need to address these issues together. So that's the person that I would say has inspired me. Also, because I feel very strongly that women need to be in politics, Angela Merkel. And I feel very strongly that Angela Merkel, no matter if you agree or disagree with her politics, I feel that she has provided an excellent image for women and for people in our world, as well as Hillary Clinton. So I've got 3.
Actually, I'm going to piggyback on that because I was just reading an article about Angela Merkel's legacy as these upcoming elections in Germany, and there's a lot of sentiment that she repels the word feminist because of the stigma of the word feminism in Germany. And I was wondering if you had any perspective. Do you have any perspectives on that, though, on her take on the fact that she doesn't consider herself to be a feminist?
I do have a take on that, because I was having an issue recently about this. I said, I do not want this to be a closed session. I want it to be a cooperative session with men and women. And that was very important to me. So I asked if one of my friends from Harvard University could come to the dinner tonight. Well, it's nothing against men. It was all the tickets are sold out, so we had no tickets. But it seems to me that we need, so I've invited him to come by at 5:30 just in the free session. To me, we need to work together. So again, cooperation. And I'd like to say that when I talk about Angela Merkel, I am a feminist, but I'm not an Andrea Dworkin feminist. I'm not a radical feminist, and I feel that she's a feminist, but she doesn't acknowledge it as such.
She was also their environment minister.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I would say she fits in my model.
Right. Clark, inspiration sources?
Yeah, actually, similarly to you, I find Angela Merkel really inspiring. I know she did chemistry and has a chemistry PhD before she went on to do politics, and Margaret Thatcher as well studied chemistry beforehand, and I found a great inspiration in that you could go from doing basic science to becoming really involved in politics, and that is a huge goal of mine, is to translate what I do, whether it be chemistry or with carbon ecology in California and forestry, and change it and turn that and translate it into something more tangible with policy and hopefully advise. But yeah, to see other women successfully have done that is incredibly inspiring. And I know I'm really early on in my path in my career, but those are 2 big people for me.
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough one. So it kind of along the lines with Jennifer, because there's so many people. What you were saying, a judge, Sonia Sotomayor, is somebody who has inspired me. I clerked in her chambers as a first-year law student, lowly nobody, but she had lunch with her clerks every single day as a Second Circuit judge, almost no matter what. There was hardly anything that could stop her from doing that. And that showed me just a graciousness and a desire to be a mentor, and just she didn't have to do that at all, but she went out of her way to help me and everybody in her office to kind of move forward in their own careers. So that aside from her brilliant opinions and everything else, just on a personal level, I thought that was pretty amazing. But on a daily basis now, what really inspires me is other people in the city of Hartford who are working on environmental issues. So for those of you who've never been to Hartford or don't know, it's one of the poorest cities in the United States. We have almost half of our children at least living under the poverty line, probably more. 46% of children speak a language other than English at home. It's a very, very challenged community. And yet, even in that demographic environment, we have so many individuals and groups that have come together for environmental causes. And so for the last couple of years, as Hila was saying, I've been working on revising the zoning code and developing a climate action plan, which we just adopted last Tuesday, trying to help everybody have a voice in that effort. And it has been so inspiring over the last 2 years to see people from all walks of life, all coming at environmental issues from all different angles. A lot of that driven by environmental justice, and the fact that everyday people are working on these issues and really trying to come together and taking time out of their free time when they don't really have the free time to give, but they're doing it because they believe in this broader vision. I mean, there's a lot of higher level policymakers out there, but it's actually that has been really inspiring and has made me work even harder at the local level to try to drive change in that area.
Yeah, it's definitely an incredible source of inspiration when you have that strength directly in front of you to be able to work off of and feed off of. And in that vein of these challenges, I would like to ask all of you what you think the most pressing environmental challenge that we all face today is, and that can be anything. But do you think that those particular challenges can be solved, and how would you maybe go about that? In a brief, it's a big deal, but I mean, let's try to bite-size it by picking one.
I mean, the political challenges are obvious, so at least in the United States and all over the world too. I mean, there's always the tension between politics and economic, factors, and people's choices about how they behave. But from a sort of topical perspective, I would think actually transportation is the lowest hanging fruit for us, because we contribute so many of our worst emissions from cars, and that's almost the easiest thing to change more immediately than how we build, how we lay out our cities. I mean, those are really big things that we have to change, but transportation is something that I think is the lowest hanging fruit. Yeah, I don't think you asked what was the lowest hanging. I think you asked what was the biggest challenge. So I'm going to answer a different question. Yeah, I think the biggest challenge is obviously politics right now.
You worked with politics and the environment and getting change to happen. What do you think that
the
biggest challenge might be?
I think the biggest challenge that it's so overarching is climate change. What else could it be? Every other issue I think about, biodiversity protection, air pollution, it all is tied in with climate change. One of my other passions is nature conservation and bird conservation, and one of the organizations I was with, we need to focus on bird conservation, not climate change. But climate change is the biggest threat to birds too, right? But as far as trying to unpack that and how do you try to solve that problem, it's a conundrum. But in the United States, it's very much politics. In a lot of the rest of the world, I think people who are at the receiving end of the damages see that it's a problem, and so for them, it's become more where are the resources to adapt to this problem, and also how do you convince the United States to continue the leadership it had before in the international sphere. But I think it's also, for all of us going to move a little bit more towards solutions, I think for people at all sorts of stages in their careers, what we have to do is make the economic case and come up with the technologies that work, and to make the solutions lower cost. Because most of the big technological shifts that we've seen globally have happened because something just became cheaper and more attractive, right? We switched from horses to cars incredibly quickly. And the prices of solar energy are going way down now to where I think that a lot of the fossil fuels are time limited just because they will no longer be the cheapest alternative. And so, like, for instance, transportation, China is going great guns on electric cars. So there's hope. I mean, that was the other thing we'll get around to more later, but it's not just that we saved the condor. There are things we can still do to, solve these problems.
Well, I don't feel that I can limit myself to one problem. I have two, just two, really quickly. Population growth, overpopulation, and climate change. I have just finished a video on climate change that is on YouTube, and so it's called the Endangered World. And so to me that is stating, and it was based on the COP21, the words from the COP21 agreement, and I'm just saying we need to act now. And when I've been doing some research, I just wrote an article that says the United States has left the Paris Agreement. Crisis or opportunity? So I encourage all of you to look on, for this article, because it's an article that I feel that we are moving. We're moving to a different part of the world. We're moving to Asia, and we're going to say to the United States, you are important. We want to encourage you to continue the work that has been done in the United States. And when I go to Bonn, the Bonn conference, COP23, I know that the states from the United States are going to come forward and say, we are continuing the work in the United States. So even though the federal government and President Trump has decided to leave the climate change agreement, it's not going to stop. And we have to work together as a group to continue that. So those are my comments of the issue, the two important issues.
From my point of view, I think it really has to do with learning enough of the basic research and the science to buy ourselves enough time to make these policy decisions. And so at least in California, doing forest carbon research and sequestration research, it's, how can we best manage our forests, which cover vast portions of the globe, to store as much carbon as possible for as long term as possible, and how can we do that now so that we don't have to turn to geoengineering and to techniques that are much more risky. They do feel a lot more risky. We don't know. So if we can have really solid answers from basic science, then that can give us enough time to actually make these political and hopefully economic changes as well.
So I'm going to be unusual, but I want to poll the audience, and I want to see from the audience, what do you feel that there's a perception that the environmental arena is a female-dominated field? So raise your hand if you think this is a female-dominated field, because I'd just like to see if anyone believes that. Okay. All right. So the majority of the audience believes this is a male-dominated field. Is that or 50-50? Okay. So 50-50, is that how many people believe it's 50-50-ish? It's a fair and balanced field. Okay. So I want to just kind of turn to that a little bit, because a lot of our scholars now are taking courses, and there's a lot more courses at Oxford available in these kinds of sustainability field and biodiversity and the kinds of courses that you've just completed, Clark. I don't know what your experience was in terms of gender balance on those courses, but I feel that there is a possible shift to where it's becoming a field with a lot more women involved. But at the higher levels, I wonder if that's really true, and I wonder if you feel that there's glass ceilings in this field, or if there's still areas that need to be broken, or where does the leadership really reside when it comes to the environmental arena, and how do women fit in? So maybe I'll start with you.
Okay, sure. Well, I think at the high levels of government, it's an area that women have succeeded in, and Environmental Protection Agency leads, you go back actually to Ronald Reagan and Gorsuch. You may not have thought she did a good job, but she was female. Lisa Jackson and Carol Browner, Christy Todd Whitman, and Gina McCarthy. I mean, you almost, if you're a little bit paranoid, think, is environment becoming, sort of where everybody puts their female ministers? I don't think that's the case yet, but I think that I would like to argue that the reason is because environmental issues overlap with actually a lot of what are considered traditional women's concerns. Health, safety, the future generations, these are things that a lot of women get passionate about. Where I don't see enough women is actually in the leadership of non-governmental organizations. Yet again, high-level management outside government often is a male-dominated realm, and we can debate all day about why that is, and there are definite exceptions. The few organizations have had women at the lead and continue to, but women are not fully represented there.
Charlie, your experience?
In my experience, I would agree with you on that it's the women tend to, I know when I was in a law firm, I was asked to develop the environmental program, and I'm thinking, all right, and I did that, but to me, it is something that we need to encourage all people to be involved in. So one thing that I have done, and I've created a handout that I invite everyone to pick up at the back of the room, and it's showing what a number of women Rhodes Scholars have done for the last 40 years and what they have contributed to. I'll give some examples. Naomi Klein, who has written This Changes Everything. I mean, I hope all of you have heard of this book. I mean, it's a wonderful book, and it talks about the fossil fuel industry and what in the world, what has happened to the world as a result of the fossil fuel industry. We have Naomi Wolf as well. We have a lady who approaches this from an evangelical. She studied what evangelical religion is doing in the world of climate change. So women have contributed a lot, and this is for the 40th anniversary of Rhodes Scholars. But also, what I found most recently is this is also the 40th anniversary of the lies and deceit that the fossil fuel industry has been promoting for us to believe climate change doesn't exist. So it's a dual anniversary. One very positive, the 40th Rhodes Women's Anniversary. One fairly negative, the fossil fuel industry giving us the lies and deceit that they have been, since 1997, been fostering. And so that has recently been, I think most people now know that is not the truth of what has been, what is, that we do have a footprint. We have created a footprint that's causing a problem with climate change. So what I would say is we need to work together, both men and women, and I don't think women are the only ones that are working in this area. It's both people, both men, both genders.
At the grassroots level, Sarah, have you seen that it's kind of a balanced participation of people working in these kinds of issues?
Yeah, I mean, in Hartford, for sure, at the local level, we have female leads on the Food Policy Commission, on Vecinos Unidos, which focuses on recycling in a Spanish-speaking neighborhood. We have women leaders at the local level. We have, a good mix, and Hartford is a very, very diverse place. I think we have a 20% white population, so majority non-white, and so our leaders are a lot of times are reflective of that. So I mean and again that kind of underscores my earlier point about what I appreciate so much about what I see happening at the local level, which is leadership from all neighborhoods, in all neighborhoods. Everybody is focused in different ways on the same thing, and so bringing them together through this, in this last couple of years, this climate action planning process where everybody could provide input, and then we see this overarching mission of environmental stewardship, but also social equity, public health, and economic development were three pillars of this plan, and everybody had something to say about all of those, and so I think at least at the local level. It's pretty, for us in Hartford, it's pretty diverse.
And
I'm Latina, so as part of that, diversity, it's, I think that reflects some part of Hartford too.
Did you have any experience on that gender balance in the academic world, both in the US and the UK here?
Yeah, I mean, in the UK it was heavily female dominated in my MSc courses, and then now that I'm at Berkeley again, it's heavily skewed towards women. In the department, so
okay. So maybe there will be a generational shift that we can see in the future. We'll see how that is. So we talked about intractable problems and the courage to work in fields where there's a lot of intractable problems, this fighting the world's fight that we've all kind of been indoctrinated with or embraced as this label of Rhodes Scholars. And I'm curious because there's a lot of people out there that they'll try to recycle one day and they'll be like, I did my part for today, or I'm going to be dead in 10 years. So they have a lot of perspectives on climate change or on environmental issues, either that they don't necessarily relate to them or there's nothing that they can really do about it. And I think it can be disheartening a lot of the times, especially when new reports come out about just the number of extinctions of birds going on each year, or of undiscovered species, or the number of forests wiped out by devastating fires and storms. So these are hard things to cope with, and I want to ask you on a personal level, how do you individually cope with working in a field that can be disheartening, and how do you cope with those negative outlooks or attitudes, that hopelessness that many people can come to experience when talking about the environment or the future?
Well, actually, during my time at Oxford, we read a book in my course called The Rambunctious Garden by Emma Maris. And I think it really changed my point of view because she talks about how, you know, traditionally like invasive species are thought of as quite negative, but actually, you know, we could envision new ecosystems where we have these new species and these new compositions. And I think that is helpful to think because we have lost a lot, but there's still a lot here that's we're fighting to save. And I think that keeps me going, and as well as just having numerous other interests, so I don't always just read the articles about the Great Barrier Reef being gone and bleached and things like that, because there's only so much you can do and control, but at least if you are in this realm, you feel like you're contributing at some level.
Can I make one comment? I am going to reach out to everybody in this group. Everyone here, I've created a one page, it's my contribution. And my contribution doesn't mean you have to have written an article, you have to have made a YouTube video or whatever. It means your ideas, because what we are going to do, and I am collaborating with my colleague at Harvard University in the Continuing Education Department, and we're going to post this material. If you agree, you can agree or not agree, and so I will only use it if you agree, and we're going to post it on the Rhodes television session on environmental justice. So hopefully these are all at the back of the room.
Jennifer, your coping strategies dealing with politicians.
It's, well, not just politicians, but it is a challenging field. I mean, in the time I've worked very intensively on climate change, we had the failure of U.S. climate legislation, which was a huge blow to the U.S. climate community. We had the Copenhagen Climate Conference, which people had hoped would launch the new negotiation, and that got postponed a few years, and that felt like a huge setback. We now have the election of a president who claims that it's not a real problem, and his secretary is taking apart the Environmental Protection Agency. So there's a lot of bad stuff. There's a lot of reason to despair. But I think the coping strategies that I and some others have is it's actually very rejuvenating and helpful to go spend time in beautiful places outdoors, to remember why you're working on this and kind of recharge your passion. I think it's also the case that it kind of depends on sort of what you were saying, how long a view you take. I get especially upset when I think about what the world will be like 100 years from now, when the things that we here care about will look very different and be very different. But our world is way different than it was 10,000 years ago. Or even if you read Elizabeth Kolbert's The Sixth Extinction, if your concern is the planet is going to be okay. Humanity maybe not so. But I don't know, I guess that taking breaks from it, and because there are so many passionate, great people working in that area, if you don't spiral down together, you spiral up together.
Thank you so much for that. I'll definitely take that and use that and hopefully recharge a little bit after each news article I have to read.
Don't read them all. Don't read them.
I think at this time what we'd like to do is move to audience questions. So if there's anybody that would like to kick us off with a question for these panelists. Ashley?
Yeah, if I may ask one. So you mentioned the climate action plans, which I believe under Gina McCartney, the EPA was trying to advance. So I wanted to ask what the panel thought about the role of the adaptation in climate change and the importance of the action plans for localities.
Yeah, well, for us, it's just to go back to the coping question. I just have tuned out all of the national, and international horror show, that's happening right now, and just focus so much on the local. And I feel like a planning process and the document that results from it is a way to inspire and engage people at the local level to all plug into the same thing. And so, our plan, for example, obviously has adaptation measures because we know climate change is already happening, and mitigation measures which try to stop or slow it. And so I mean, I guess to your question about the role of adaptation, we recognize that it's happening even at the local level, even in this, volunteer-driven, community-driven process. It's something that we've all recognized is a fact, that adaptation is happening. But as I said, the planning process itself is really a way to keep everybody sort of, moving forward as much as possible at the local level. So we cover energy, we cover food. We have a very robust food community in Hartford. Transportation, landscape, waste issues. We have composting, pilots going. We have, recycling initiatives that we're trying to get moving, and water quality issues, because that's been a big issue in Hartford too. But everybody can see through this planning effort how they might be able to do their part, because we've broken it down into strategies that people can use. And I think that's helpful, rather than maybe the grand proclamations of international bodies. Maybe now's the era where you really do get down to that level and kind of work to make change at the local level first.
Adaptation is essential. And in fact, adaptation used to refer to adapting for future problems. As you said, it's already happening. And the raising of the storm barriers, or the coming up with crops that are more drought resistant, the discovering ways to deal with diseases in latitudes that they never used to be in, all that is happening right now. If anybody in this room thinks that climate change is a future problem, please don't leave the room thinking that. So the thing is, you have to do both. And for a while, the environmental community didn't want to talk about adaptation because they thought it would detract from a focus on mitigation, which is reducing emissions or avoiding emissions. Now we have to talk about both and geoengineering, because you also will not get the planet where it needs to be without taking carbon out of the atmosphere and out of the ocean. There's already so much in there that we have very bad outcomes baked in, unless we figure out also how to extract carbon.
Thanks for your question. Yes.
I wanted to sort of pick up on this, which I heard several of you talking about action at the local level, at the level of cities. And I don't know what's going on in England, but there's a really significant effort across higher education nationally within the United States around both climate action, mitigation, and resilience. And over 600 colleges and universities have set a target for climate neutrality, and there's a sort of joint accountability network. So in addition to the really great work that's happening at the local campus and local city level, I think there's also ways in which networks can be frameworks of accountability, and especially at a time when the federal government is either actively working against trying to solve the problem, or in paralysis, which Congress certainly has been sort of in paralysis. I think a lot of good work can be done. So I'm from Georgia at Agnes Scott College. Georgia went from 0 to the 7th largest state for solar, and the higher ed community was part of what was really, and the NGO community was part of what was really pushing that. So I don't know what's happening at Oxford. I mean, I'd be interested in any of the current scholars, like to what extent are the colleges here and the higher ed community in the UK being, aggressive in terms of both mitigation and resilience. I'd be interested.
Can I speak to one issue? We're working, and this is my friend Tim Weiskell and I are working, he's with the Continuing Education Department at Harvard, and so we're working to try and bring the Oxford Continuing Education Department into the realm of developing courses that are available for people at large that can, because much is about, I'm going to say we're almost past the need for awareness. We're into the need for to adapt to the issues, and we're at the need, and that's why I'm asking for your comments, because every one of you have ideas, comments, and we just need to brainstorm as much as we can to bring this knowledge to the people, and that's what we're trying to do. So hopefully through continuing education that will be open not just to Oxford scholars, it will be open to everyone. And so to me that is important as well. So
I think universities play a big role. I mean, and it's because students are more interested in the topic. So, we're just, using our little plan, as an example, we had 29 college interns from 6 different schools, including UC Berkeley. There's a team from the School of Public Policy. One of them was Hartford-based, and so they did their capstone project on, something that we needed them to do. Trinity College, University of Hartford, of course, UConn, the law school, and the business school. And so we had students love to work on. So it's another way to get them engaged, because colleges are, focused right now on service learning. And so in your towns, where you have colleges and universities, it's a really, there's really fruitful collaboration that can occur.
And can I just piggyback? I mean, I absolutely agree, and I would also say that colleges can be laboratories for, we've reduced our greenhouse gas emissions by 20% at my college. There are colleges that are now climate neutral. And American University, Georgetown, and George Washington have collaboraed on utility scale solar installations that are actually shifting the energy mix of large scale utility. So I think even at the level of mitigation, you can scale up. I mean, it's like Hartford is a wonderful example, and I think cities could also collaborate and start to scale up solutions to a point where it's actually changing the energy mix of the country. So that's to your point about action.
Yeah.
I think there really are actions, and we have to scale them, and I'm getting at the same point of we're not paralyzed.
Right.
We can actually make a difference as in different sectors of the society, even when the story is so grim at the federal level.
Right, and that's why in my essay, it's crisis or opportunity. It seems to me that what President Trump has done is he's opened the opportunity for groups such as as the colleges that we're talking about and the adaptation programs that we're talking about to move forward much faster and much more directly, because he's brought the issue to the head. We have to deal with things. So that to me is a very positive aspect.
I actually want to piggyback real quick off of your question about kind of the role of education, because I'm interested in how did any of us get to the point where we even care about the environment enough to pursue this as a career? So what was it that made you be environmentally minded, either in early childhood or in your developmental years into university? And how do you think that can be integrated into future generation, primary education or any kind of learning, so that we can make the individual changes necessary? Have any of you thought about what brought you to this in reality?
Well, I think I'm pretty clear on what brought me to it, but I'm not sure it's scalable across kids. I grew up in a small town on the edge of the Ohio River, woods all the way down to the river, 400 feet of bluffs. So that was my playground, right? The woods, which was spectacular. And then over here, also in our view, was one of the biggest coal-fired power plants in the Ohio River Valley, belching smoke. So, I kind of had both those influences right there. But I think education is essential. It's also important, though, in the United States at least, trying to move away from projecting it as a moral issue that causes the backlash, right? You don't want local educational systems trying to prohibit the teaching about environment or climate change because they think it's a liberal, agenda. But I think kids need to spend more time outdoors. They need to get to the national parks. They need to get to their local parks. They need to appreciate the complexity of the ecosystem that they're living in.
I have 3 little kids, so I think about this a lot. And we have them at a school, Montessori school, where they can freely go outside and inside at any time during the day. They all have gardens. In our Harvard school system, more generally, we try to have school gardens, food-producing gardens, as well as ornamental plants and that kind of thing. I think that has been totally lost in our system of public education today. There's not a feeling that you need to go outside and breathe and have the recess and just look at some leaves with your teacher. It's all about testing and minutes in the classroom and making sure that you you know, there's some schools, you know, that some of our friends' kids go to that they don't get any time outdoors. They get it twice a week at this point because everybody's so rigid about testing it. And when you don't have your kids in sunlight, I mean, it just, they're like flowers, you know. I mean, if you don't give them air and oxygen and sunlight, they're never gonna grow. And so at a very base level, they, you know, a lot of kids are growing up without that connection to just being outdoors. I think.
I grew up in the prairie region, and so I'm very familiar with the Aboriginal community, and I'm working now a lot with the Aboriginal community because, like you said, we have to bring awareness of the importance of working with the world, not working using the world, but working as part of the world. And so the Aboriginal people recognize that. I will also say that my mother donated most of her land to the various environmental projects. And so in that sense, it's something that has been a part of my background. But it seems to me that all of us have an aspect in the past that has brought us to understand the importance of living together in this beautiful world. And so, you know, all of us have one aspect that brought us to this point, but there's so much that we need to do in the next 40 years.
Sorry, did you still have a question?
That's okay, go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah, my question is actually tied to what we've all been watching and kind of recognizing that nature will be nature. The hurricanes, Harvey, Irma, I keep hearing that others are following on their heels, and I recently read an article that was talking about why it is that hurricanes are getting more violent, and it's all tied to climate change. And we all keep hearing the story with hints of, well, these are signs of climate change. I think my question is, what does that mean, and what are the opportunities for those of us who care about the environment to get people not to just focus on, oh my God, the tragedy, but how does this look back to what our policymakers are doing or not doing, especially in terms of pushing forward the agreements that we thought would finally get us to a place where there can be greater coherence and discussion around climate change.
Any thoughts? Do you want to start?
Hurricanes are complicated because the cause and effect is difficult, but there seems to be a pretty strong scientific consensus that climate change provides reasons for hurricanes to be more violent. And you can see that in the warmer waters of the Atlantic, making these Category 5 hurricanes that we don't often see. There's a terrible record of typhoons hitting the Philippines, that sort of thing. But how you use that moment is, I think, everybody's challenge. It seems that more and more people are recognizing the reality of climate change. You're hearing governors, mayors, you know, it seems like almost everybody except the federal government in my country is appreciating this as a problem. When I talk to people in other countries, like the Africans know that they're at the receiving end of this stuff and they're not causing much of the problem, and so it's a big political issue. I think that for anyone, at least in the United States, one of the big problems is politicians don't think you vote on environmental issues. They always poll well, because when you're answering these questions, of course you care about the environment, but very seldom is that going to be like your single issue the way it might be like gun control or opposing abortion. And so the environmental community has seldom had the political leverage to counteract the incredible pressure from the fossil fuel community. So that's, at a political level, something that has to change.
I feel you've raised a very, very important point. And we talked about hurricanes, we talk about bushfire, we talk about wildfires, we talk about droughts, and this is happening. I moved to Spain because of the heat. I love the heat, but now it's so hot that you can't do anything. You know, you can barely walk most of the time because it's so hot. And so we are all experiencing the climate change. And in Africa, I know there's a lot of droughts in many places. And so one of the things I recently read a book that's called Resource Wars, and that's all about the natural resources and specifically oil and gas. And so it's showing that there's a continuing attempt to use right to the very bitter end all of our oil and gas resources in this world. And that to me has to stop. And the author of the book says it needs to stop. And the only way we can make it stop is to act cooperatively, not with the United States, Canada, the big nations, the great 5 nations, whatever, all nations across the world. And that's what the Paris Agreement has done, and that's what we need to continue to do in my signature.
This is just a semantic question, but actually I mean it more than that. Did you think about titling your essay instead of Crisis or Opportunity? Crisis and Opportunity.
That's good. What did I call it? It's crisis, I called it crisis or, well, yes.
I suggest that we dismiss it as a crisis and
Yeah.
see it as only as an opportunity. And it seems to me that part of the challenge of getting people to focus on this is to somehow convey the urgency of it as a crisis.
That's right. No, it's true. I agree with you. I think that's a good idea in the sense that wasn't my first talk. That wasn't how I first titled it, but I was convinced by one of my colleagues to change the title. I said, oh, okay, you win a little bit. But anyway, so what I had, because I'm a little bit upset about what England has done, so I was calling it Exit or Opportunity. But
Brexit.
yeah, because of Brexit. So I'm saying, okay, I had to change it because, okay, Exit or Opportunity didn't work. I think your title is a very good title. So I need to change my title. Thank you.
Actually, to your point, I think it would behoove scientists to forego some modesty and not call it climate change, but to call it something like climate chaos, or something that's actually much more indicative of what's going on. And climate change just sounds so neutral and like that's possibly a good thing even, and to really name something correctly would be really helpful. And we get these incredible images, and especially with the hurricanes, to your point, just the image from NASA with the 3 hurricanes all lined up in the Caribbean, and just like, that's a powerful image, and just use these things to show it is very chaotic.
Thanks, Clark. Yeah, that's a really good point. We have 2 questions. I'll start with you.
Okay. I'm curious, you referred to it because you're not studying it, but Jennifer, you referred to it. Are there actually geotechnical things that are on the horizon that are going to help? And if so, what can we do to move things along?
Do you want to start? Or? I think you should start. I don't want to.
Okay. Okay, so a couple things. There's the area of geoengineering.
That's what I meant.
Yeah, okay, so I guess the first thing I would say is if you did that without reducing emissions, you may limit how much warming there is, but you have to keep doing the geoengineering things because the moment you stop, the temperatures will spike, right? So that's one reason that geoengineering is not an answer in and of itself. Some of the techniques that have been considered and are being experimented on include things like solar radiative management. You can put little tiny bits of reflective silicon in the upper atmosphere and it reflects away sunlight. They precipitate out after a couple years, and so it's not a long-term solution, but it wouldn't take that much for one country to put up a lot of small planes and put a lot of that stuff in the atmosphere. So there's a whole concern around geoengineering about how do you regulate it, how do you do the research safely, but that's one technique. Another one is doing things to create more cloud cover. Those are one area. Another area that's more, I would argue, constructive, benign, I don't know quite the right word, but for instance, there are considerations of could you find new species of trees or breed or geoengineer trees to absorb carbon more quickly, to take more out of the atmosphere. There's this company that I have great hope succeeds, which has figured out how to precipitate out carbon compounds from seawater as an input into making cement. Okay, you know, and there's a huge need for more basic research in this area to come up with new techniques. So that's sort of a political agenda, is to get more research money funding in that way and for more smart Oxford graduates to go into that field. But there are also ways to use the carbon dioxide that's generated from chemical processes to feed it back into other compounds. There's carbon storage, which is to put carbon dioxide down into underground areas that have been vacated by oil or gas or things like that. There's a whole suite of things. There's no silver bullet yet, and there's more work that needs to be done, but it needs to be done.
Can carbon be compressed into a solid or?
Diamonds.
Make more diamonds. Actually.
Start a Next Road Scholarship. The next generation of diamond money through carbon.
I think the concern of the compression is the energy inputs, unless you were using solar, would itself be a source of emissions.
Clark, do you want to elaborate any more?
I mean, I think that's, really good.
A lot of the
overview.
technology.
It's going to be hard. The science is not completely worked out, and so it is risky at the moment. And there are probably other better ways.
Yeah. There are also these ideas about trying to get char and bury it, thinking that you can increase the carbon content of soils. And there's some there's some ways to manage grasslands and stuff to increase the soil matter or the root mass in soils, but they're not necessarily multi-100-year solutions.
You had a question?
Yeah, so I teach climate change science and policy at Rutgers. So this spring semester was like every week it was like there's something new we have to talk about because climate policy is changing for the worse. But one of the things that I've been thinking about and kicking around with some colleagues since the US election is this idea that those of us in higher education in particular who work on climate change, we speak to our students, but we don't necessarily speak to larger audiences. And we've been somewhat inspired by a group that put together a syllabus about Standing Rock, the US political protests surrounding oil pipeline on indigenous lands, which has received something like close to 1 million downloads in a very short amount of time. So there's a public hunger for syllabi, which seems odd for those of us in higher education concerned don't actually look at them very often. But, so anyways, we've been thinking about this idea of if we did a public climate change syllabi, what would we want people to read? What do we think there's a hunger for? I think a lot of students who are not in environmental sciences probably read Elizabeth Colbert's Field Notes from a Catastrophe, but then they never go beyond that. So I would like to know, each of you, if there is a piece of writing, or it could be a scientific paper, anything that you think just kind of stuck with you and would be something that would be useful to have in a sort of public climate change syllabus that you think other people would benefit from reading.
I have two, and very briefly, Naomi Klein, please pick up the paper at the end. I mentioned what Bremen had written about, Rhodes Scholars have written about, and what they have published. Naomi Klein would be one person. Also, the Aboriginal people in North America and in the Standing Rock as well. So I think that is important to be included in the work.
I read too many law review articles to put in a public syllabus. I'm racking my brain for a good, accessible one. But there's a lot of law review and policy articles out there, and I'm happy to send you my top 10 outside of this probably.
Going multimedia, I would recommend the film Chasing Ice.
Right.
Which is made at Rutgers. So,
Oh, cool.
Yeah. Do you guys know this?
Mm-hmm.
Fantastic. These people put fixed cameras in various places all over the world over years and years and years to watch receding glaciers, melting ice, some incredible scenes of a calving the size of Manhattan, right? It's profound proof of the ice we're losing.
Yeah, that film actually really personifies climate change, and I think a big problem that people have is being able to visualize it and see it as a character, and if it's the subject of the movie, you really get that sense. I think it's really powerful.
As an example of it, if we're going non-academic, hartford.gov/climate is where our climate action plan is. And I think it's actually a really accessible document just as a model for you know, there's the New York plan, there's the San Francisco, Chicago plans. I mean, these are like, you know, no normal city can do planning like that. But if, you know, you want to sort of 120,000 person, you know, 80-page, easy to flip through. I mean, it's. I think it's a clear model for climate action plan at the local level. So I will make a little plug for that.
Okay. I guess for that one last question. So go ahead.
I think one of the challenges that I see with the climate change and sustainability community is that it's just so far removed from what the ordinary person can understand. For me, I'll watch these videos of like glaciers melting, and then I'm like scared, thinking we're all gonna die, but then I don't know what to do after that. And the data itself is secretive, and just from a sort of data science AI perspective, it casts a shadow of doubt as to whether these facts that are being reported are true and whether they have been vetted by a global open source community. So to address this, has there been any initiatives that makes this data open source? So for example, can I today go to a website and access all these webcams and actually see ice melting? Or are there sensors that are reporting some of this data, such as the droughts that are happening in Southern Africa at the moment? And can I have access to this data and plot for myself what is happening over time? Because I think this transparency would go a great way in helping people to own the problem of climate change and have it not be something that experts tell you that the world is burning, but you actually, you'd like to be able to understand quantitatively what is going on.
That's a good question.
I would just mention there's online you can go to transition studies. This is a finite planet, and I would just go www.transition studies, and it has an ongoing list of resources about all of those issues that you're talking about. So I can give you the website address. I'm not technical, you see, when it comes to trying to get all the wwws and the https's, but I can provide it to you. Okay.
I would say also things like ocean temperature over time, the air samplers that are measuring the parts per million of carbon, and a lot of that is the U.S. government collects a lot of information, and the U.S. Geological Survey. I think that information, I don't know if there's a website where it's available, but it's certainly public information and publicly accessible, reaching in some way. Maybe some of you others can
I was
answer that
thinking
better.
the National Climate Assessment might be, because that was actually fairly open source. I mean, there were probably 35,000 people who contributed to the National Climate Assessment, and I think all of that data is publicly available. I think the most recent report came out in 2015. And actually one of the things that, again, this is kind of a US context, but I think it really hits people when you realize that the state of North Carolina is planning to move state highways because of ocean level change. So it actually goes region by region. Now again, it's a US-centric report, but there are probably other examples from other countries of these sort of federal reports that have a lot of people contributing to them.
And as far as raw data, you can get some of that from the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. So NOAA, which oversees the National Hurricane Center, which has come to prominence in the last few weeks with the data for tracking hurricanes, that's all part of that. The USGS, like you mentioned, which tracks worldwide earthquakes, all of that's downloadable and accessible. And NASA and other organizations. So, and then the IPCC reports are all
lots of data.
Very accessible. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, all of their reports and data are downloadable and have some useful infographics that I think this generation benefits from infographics a lot. That's what social media feeds are full of. So I think
So this is all for the United States, right?
the IPCC is intergovernmental. It's worldwide.
Yeah,
but
it's a body that basically is made up of scientists all over the world, like hundreds of scientists, each contributing to different chapters of this report, and a major comprehensive report is required to come out every 4 years. that was one of the products of the original UN climate agreement. And so there's a whole history of these reports, and then what mostly gets the public attention is the summary, where they try to articulate by consensus, the degree of certainty of humans contributing to the problem and what the problem is. But it's very powerful.
And I did include that in my paper as well.
And I'll just add that if the main goal is not to get to some of the summary reports, but to the raw data, it may actually take a little bit of digging. And so if anyone in the room is a sort of computer science, open source type person, it potentially would be nice to make some of these archives more accessible. But for example, the US government, I know that there's a network of weather stations in Oceania. There's probably something similar in basically every continent, but sometimes you have to dig to find the right agency responsible. It's in some quasi-esoteric archive or webpage. So yeah, the extent to which the data become more accessible is something that maybe goes also to the heart of your question.
Yes, because in this particular context, some of our colleagues are working on the air pollution. So we have data from the weather company, but we've actually had to put out our research with the people we have. I think this the climate change data is heavily prioritized, and until such time it can be open source and released, it becomes difficult for people to quantify what is happening and to sort of assure yourself that what you're being told is actually the truth. Maybe I'm part of the minority of people who wants to actually see the data for myself.
I'm a scientist, so I understand that desire. I would say like some of the other resources, I don't know the state of collection in which agency in South Africa or Southern Africa would be responsible. I just don't know. But for example, airports are someplace that usually keep very long-term records of climate count. In what format they keep them, I don't know, but they have them because they've required them for operations, right? So.
And thank you all for your comments on that. We can continue that conversation in the unconference sessions Sunday, essentially. So I know there's a lot of people in here that work in the scientific realm and would be happy to kind of continue that conversation. As far as our time now, if I could maybe wrap up with you amazing ladies, and we could talk about just any of your takeaways or action points that you would like the ordinary road scholar, the ordinary person to take away from a lifetime, long or short, of work in this arena. I think that we'll have time for about a minute from each of you on that. Do you want to start with Clark? Do you want to start on just any takeaways you have from this panel? Climate chaos.
I like that
takeaway.
suggestion.
I like that.
I guess for myself, what I aim to do is, if there are scientific questions, is to explain it in an approachable way, what I work on, so as to, I think a lot of times scientists get a rap that they're kind of snickering at you if you don't understand or that they don't want to explain. And so for myself, it's just always to read as much as I can and to try to present it in a comprehensible way and to work on my own science communication skills. I think scientists have found out rather late that we haven't done a great job in communicating what's been going on. So I guess that's a personal goal, is to continue on that. In terms of takeaways, gosh, just, doing what you can at the local level, even if it doesn't feel like that, because you compost, that it's not doing anything. Like, those things do add up, and to try to find the smaller ways that you can contribute in wherever you live.
Thank you.
I would say go local. That would be my my only suggestion.
And I will go before the last person speaks, and I will say I'm going to move from being the technical legal person on this panel to go to my work as a journalist and a writer. And so I've written a book, and this is, to me, I will provide a bookmark for each of you here, and this is to remind you that this is the question that we're asking ourselves, and this panel, this session, is can we save the human race? So this is what we spoke about this a little bit earlier, because the planet will survive, but is the human race going to survive? Now, this is a totally fictional book, and it reflects, I wrote it before Donald Trump was elected, but it reflects the issues of reality, fantasy, what is the truth, what is false. and that's what this is about. So I'm just going to ask perhaps Jennifer if you could just pass these out.
I guess my closing thoughts are a little bit sort of gap filling, which is this our conversation focused rather heavily on North America, and the climate problem and the climate solutions are global. And I guess when I think about where to try to contribute constructively to solving the problem, it's ensuring that the developing world develops as it needs to, but without making the mistakes that the developed world made. And that includes trying to meet people's power needs with renewables, and also really building in energy efficiency. One of the best ways to reduce emissions is to convert to greater energy efficiency. We waste so much in the building sector and in appliances. And one of the things I worked on, this Montreal Protocol Agreement, is going to change the kind of chemicals that go into air conditioning and refrigeration. And that is a huge source of demand in the developing world because people are getting richer, so they want and need more air conditioning and refrigerated food supply chains, and the world is getting hotter, so we all need more air conditioning. But in a lot of cities, air conditioners are 80% of the energy use, for instance, in big cities in China. So finding the transition to more energy efficient appliances is a big piece of reducing the growth in emissions in the rest of the world.
And I'd just like to close. Thank you all for your time here. And I think the Rose community is starting to kind of develop these opportunities for us to have these discussions and to have practical discussions, including with the summit that was on climate change this past April. And that will be likely to continue at Rhodes House in the near future in the next couple of years. So I'd encourage you to participate in things like that, but also that very important point about including all the communities and all of the representation that we have in our Rhodes community and drawing on those strengths to make sure that we have leadership across the world in this arena and in the developing and the developed world to make sure that we continue these conversations productively and equip people with the tools to be able to understand that data and communicate it across law and politics and science and technical and practical aspects. So I appreciate all of your work, importantly your actual work that you do in this field, and also your time in being here with us this weekend. And I hope that you can all join me in giving a round of applause to our panel.